So thank you very much for that introduction. I also want to join the rest of the speakers here in welcoming you today to this event, which I'm really excited about speaking at, because actually you're going to be dealing with one of the areas that is really close to my heart, and that is how do you actually create collaboration between startups and corporations to create some truly great breakthrough innovations. Now, you may not know this, but you are actually taking part in a great experiment. And it's an experiment that has lived through the ages in many, many different contexts. If you think about international diplomacy, if you think about nature, if you think even of the battle of the sexes, it all comes down to one fundamental question, which is how do you cooperate and collaborate with a counterpart that has a fundamentally different view of the world than you do, yet you still need each other to create something great? The very short answer is you can do so if you have some sort of shared interest or shared goal. And if you're an entrepreneur here or a startup founder who maybe has a really exciting new solution to an old problem, or if you're the representative of one of the great multinational companies in the automobile industry who's represented here today, you're both here because you believe there's an opportunity to create great innovation and to do something that could potentially have a breakthrough in your business. But there's a problem. And the problem is that you actually don't speak the same language. Now, I'm not doubting your English skills or your ability to communicate productively in Hungarian. When I mean that you don't speak the same language, I'm saying that you actually are coming from very different environments with very different expectations, different views of what business is about, of what success looks like, of how you achieve that type of success. And for that reason, is a really big challenge to figure out, okay, so how do you work together to create something great? In the same way that if you drop me into, let's say, the assembly line at an Audi plant and you ask me to come up with a more creative way of, building a car, I wouldn't be able to do anything because I'm not an engineer, I don't understand the industry, I don't understand the language. It would be a big challenge for me. But I'm optimistic because actually if you look at what's going on in the world of automotive innovation, there are a tremendous number of successful cooperations between startups and corporations. In fact, I found a study that showed there are currently 5,000 automotive-related startups working with corporations around the world in the most diverse areas affecting the industry, from self-driving cars to Internet of Things to manufacturing. And I like to believe that these relationships are all built on one fundamental principle. That is the principle of understanding. There's a great quote from a poem from 1895, and it says, "To understand a man, you must walk a mile in their shoes." And I believe that at the end of the day, what you need to do in this day and in your cooperation moving forward is to walk a mile in the other person's shoes to understand what their point of view is. And once you've done that, then create some understanding of a common definition of success and a path that will get you to that desired outcome. And so what I want to do today is to share with you some of my insights about what you can expect from this journey of discovery, starting first with an examination of what I would call the corporate mindset. Okay, so how does a corporation think and operate? What is important to them? How can you collaborate with a corporation? Then I want to walk in the other shoe and talk to you a little bit about the startup mindset. Okay, so how does a startup operate? What does a startup do well? What doesn't it do well? What can you expect from a cooperation with a startup? And once I've done that, I want to finally talk about some specific tips about how to collaborate effectively together. Now, what I'm going to be sharing with you is not based on something that I read in a book, or listened to in a podcast, or was told by a friend. In my 30-year global career, I've spent 20 years in the corporate environment, in the media industry, but rising to a regional CEO level and eventually to global senior vice president, and 10 years as an entrepreneur, starting my own business and selling it, investing into tech startups, having a successful exit in that capacity, but also in what I do today, which is effectively to mentor and support business-to-business tech startups to help them scale globally by applying this 9-step business development framework referenced earlier called the Launch Code. And so what I like to say is that, in fact, what I'm about to tell you is comes from somebody who has sat in the corner office of a large glass skyscraper in central London overseeing a $650 million business, but also somebody who has sat on a carton box in an empty flat in Budapest writing the business plan for their own company. And so perhaps from that perspective, I can offer you some insight that you might not have from your own perspective. So, you know, I had the pleasure to work for NBC Universal, large media company based in the corporate headquarters, international corporate headquarters in London for several years. And in that capacity, I got an insight into how corporations at that level operate. And there are many different examples that bring to light this point of view. But one particular one sticks in my mind, and it happens to be by coincidence related to Hungary. I say by coincidence because, in fact, out of the $650 million business that I oversaw, Hungary was a tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver. It just so happens that back in the mid-2013-14, the Hungarian government had come out with a new law, a regulation. And this regulation required certain industries to pay a loyalty tax or some sort of extra tax to support the economic growth of the country, and the media industry was impacted by this as well. And according to the regulation, if you generated more than $500,000 of revenue in the Hungarian market, you were required to pay this tax. One day I found myself on the receiving end of an email chain. On this email was, and I'm sure my former corporate colleagues can appreciate this, about 18 people in CC with about 7 people in the to list, and literally, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of emails from the legal department, the finance department, the business people, all of them discussing the company's obligation to pay this tax. And after a while, after seeing this, I noticed that one of the suggestions from the legal department was to hire outside counsel to investigate this particular regulation in Hungary. Well, I made a quick phone call and I checked with the finance department. I confirmed what I suspected, which is that, in fact, our revenues in Hungary were $485,000. I took a deep breath and I wrote the following email. I can say with 100% certainty that $485,000 is less than $500,000, and therefore we are not obligated to pay this tax. And I wrote the sentence that probably is never stated ever in a corporate environment: I take 100% responsibility for this decision. And we didn't pay the tax. I suggested that we take the tens of thousands of dollars we saved on legal costs and put it into a bonus pool for the organization. I'm not sure if they accepted my recommendation. The reason I tell this story is because the fundamental driving principle of a corporation is to achieve certainty at all costs. With the exception of the potentially top few people at the very top of the organization, the entire company is based on creating the smallest possibility of uncertainty. And this is done through a whole range of ways that impact the way that corporations operate. So how do corporations operate? So scenario planning is the fundamental principle of a corporation. There are whole teams of people that do nothing but plan for scenarios, trying to figure out every possible outcome that could possibly happen in any situation. And this is why sometimes in corporations you have meetings to discuss what you will discuss in the meetings. In corporations, generally speaking, there is a significant avoidance of speed or urgency, right? There's no particular urgency to take action because action means you take risk, and if you take risk, you actually risk your job. There's a great saying in the United States in the 1950s. This is before the big technology boom. There was one player in town. They were called IBM. And there was a saying, you never get fired for buying IBM. That is basically what IBM built its entire business on in the 1950s and 1960s. What else you should know about the corporate environment is that if they get behind a project, however, despite all of the difficulties in planning and avoidance of risk, once they get behind something, man, they really get behind something. resources, people, money, literally the sky's the limit. And that is why they are a fantastic partner for startups, because they have the resources, once committed, to really build a really significant business with you. So what does this mean for startups? Well, if you want to work with corporations, there's a couple of things you better be keeping in mind. The first is the concept of you putting on your t-shirt and jeans and going into a boardroom and kind of convincing people that you're really cool and fantastic and really innovative doesn't work. You better know your stuff. That means you better have a very clear understanding of what your problem is that you solve, how you solve it, and why you are better than the competition. And you better be able to explain it in a 12-page PowerPoint. Because if you can't, you simply will not be taken seriously. The other thing you should understand is that when you enter these relationships, you better be thinking long-term. Not because of the pace of decision-making, but because corporations don't want to do business with people who are not going to be around in 12 to 14 months. So be prepared to offer an insight into your funding and your capabilities for the long term. And the average development time for a car is 7 years. The average development time for a technology, if it's hardware, is 1 year. If it's an application, it's about 3 to 4 months. There's a really big disconnect there. And so you as a startup better be able to demonstrate that you're going to be around in 7 years. In fact, for the decades afterwards, hopefully, in which the car that you've maybe contributed to is still on the road. And finally, if you're going to do business with a corporation, make sure you do something that does not have small incremental benefits realized over the long term. If you want a company to make a significant bet on yours, you better have a major impact on their business. Do something that matters, because if it doesn't matter, it's going to get killed. That's what startups should know about dealing with corporations. What's the other side of the equation? So I read a recent piece of research from a company called CB Insights, and they had analyzed the life cycle of 113 US startups, and they looked at why all of these startups had failed. So it was an analysis of basically what happened. And in this analysis of the situation, they determined that 38% of startups failed because they ran out of money. They didn't have enough time to build the product that they have. And when I say ran out of money, I don't mean they borrowed money from their grandparents and they ran out of money. In some cases, these startups raised as high as $250 million. And they simply ran out of time. Another 20% of these startups that failed were outcompeted in the marketplace. In other words, somebody was quicker to the market, they were able to find product market fit more quickly, and they basically killed this company. The common denominator in both of these, for the 58% of companies that failed, was time. So the fundamental driving force of a startup is speed. It's speed to market. It's speed to relationships. It's speed to product development. It's speed to market. That is what defines a startup, because if it doesn't define it, there's always a danger they're going to run out of money or somebody's going to be there first. So what does this mean for the way that a startup works, corporations? Well, there's a tremendous time pressure in startup world that defines the way they develop their products. They're constantly developing a product, getting feedback, iterating, developing a product, getting feedback, iterating. There's never, in a startup, the product is never done. It is simply in a next stage of almost perfect. Sales in a startup environment is constantly under pressure. It's about closing deals, about getting things done, not just because they have to build traction so that they know that their solution actually works, but because they need to generate cash to fund their growth. And so this time pressure defines the attitude of a startup in their relationship with their partners. In addition, because of this speed, don't expect too much structure in the world of a startup. I like to call it controlled chaos, right? It's all about doing a lot of stuff at the same time. There's a natural evolution to this, right? At the beginning, there's more chaos than towards the end. But fundamentally, this chaos is overwhelming within a startup, and it's something that needs to be managed and accepted and discussed by all parties involved. And finally, and this is the good part, when there is chaos, despite the time pressure, one thing you can guarantee, if a startup gets the opportunity to deliver, they will do everything in their power to deliver. They will work 20 hours a day. They will find additional solutions. They're going to call in all the favors they need to deliver what they promised because their life depends on it. And that's a very important perspective, is that for a startup, plan B is, well, I screwed up, I'll just get another job at another company doing the same thing. It's, I'm going to move back with my parents in my bedroom, and I'm going to have to figure out what's next. The stakes are high. So what does this mean for corporations? What is it that you should keep in mind as you're working with a startup? The first is your communication should be clear and regular. That means offering very clear and unequivocal feedback if something's not working, if something needs more time, if something is not clear, if just simply the process of communication is very important. In corporate world, silence is golden because that means nobody's asking the tough questions. In startup world, silence is agonizing. Not hearing back, not getting a response to your email, not getting your calls returned is agonizing because it leaves open the question of what's happening. And if you want to build a strong partnership with a startup, answer the emails, return the phone calls, even if that takes literally 30 seconds of your time and just means we're on it, we're still waiting for ... The second thing you should know about working with a startup is that it's critical that you appoint an owner on your side of the business, corporations, because you're speaking to owners on the startup side. What that means is don't expect an outside individual to understand the mechanics of your internal decision-making maze and matrix. Give people an opportunity to understand that there's somebody there they can turn to that can say, look, this is what's going on, this is what's going to have to happen, sit tight, I'm on it, and give that person the authority to at least communicate and even better yet, make some decisions. And finally, if the answer is no, make sure it's a quick no. Startups cannot afford to wait for your 17 meetings to decide whether or not what you're doing is worthy of further exploration. They don't have the time. So the best answer is yes, from their perspective. The worst answer is we'll see or maybe. The second best answer is no. Okay, so if something's not there, it's not getting traction, it's not going to work, just tell them no. And if you really want to be cool, then tell them why no or why not now. And the reason is because that's going to enable them to then go back and try to fix that and maybe come back to you later with a solution that's better suited for your problem. Or better yet, you'll actually generate good karma. And you'll be known as the company that actually is collaborative with startups. And you at one point, you might actually get startups coming to you that really solve big problems, and they'll know that they're talking to someone or an organization that takes them seriously. So, having now dressed both of you down on the corporate and the startup side, let me talk about collaboration and what needs to happen in order for you to actually be successful in working together. So the first thing that I think is critical is determine what success looks like. And what I mean by that is at the very beginning, be very transparent, first of all, about what your weaknesses are as an organization, what your strengths are, what you can deliver, what you can't, and define a clear picture of what success looks like. How are you going to determine whether this relationship is working or not? Is it sold units? Is it revenues? Is it efficiency growth? Whatever. Determine success and agree on that together. The second is, once you have a clearly desired outcome, create a clear path to a decision or to a final go-no decision. Create milestones you can agree on. Is it you have to have sign up from this person or that person, you have to have this test product tested or that test product tested. Obviously, as you progress in the relationship, this will be defined more and more, but if you can create a clear path to a decision, it gives everybody the comfort that they know where they are on the map, yeah? And you enable that open communication, which is so critical for a strong relationship. Very important to define who does what, right? Most partnerships, in my opinion, fall into this category. 40% of the stuff is clearly one side's responsibility, 40% of the stuff is the other side's responsibility, and then 20% sits right in the middle in that gray area, and everybody's waiting for the other guy to pick up the ball. Yeah? Sound familiar? Don't let that 20% sit there, because that's the difference between success and failure. Clearly define who does what, who takes responsibility for what, and sometimes take the initiative and just say, I'll do it, because actually that's going to move things forward. make sure that you track your progress. So create certain time periods, whether it's personal meetings, whether it's video meetings, whether it's email updates, that you know you can count on, so you'll get a progress report on what's going on, okay? Just agree on this. It'll be every 2 weeks, Mondays at 4. Because it's going to enable you to make adjustments necessary, because things change. You know, life isn't so perfect that you plan it day one and everything happens the same way. Track your progress, make adjustments, move forward, make sure that that's clear for everybody. And finally, don't try to change the world on day one. Find quick wins that build trust and build traction. And once you've created that trust and when you've created that traction, then build on that. Don't try to change the world in one day, but make sure that the end game is big enough to matter. So, you're all probably thinking, boy, this is really tough, right? This is a lot of stuff we got to focus on. This is going to be a lot harder than I imagined. I want to end up with a message of hope and a message of potential and promise. There's a psychologist named John Gray, and he published a book in 1992 called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. I don't know if you've heard of this book. It sold something like 15 million copies around the world, so it's quite a successful book. And this book, when it came out, really redefined how couples looked at their relationship. Because what it actually stated was, your wife's not crazy, your husband's not crazy, you just live on different planets, right? Men live on Mars, women live on Venus. They are accustomed to their own cultures, their own expectations of what conflict resolution is and what. All you need to do to be successful in a relationship is to understand where the other one's coming from and find common ground. And it presents a really specific way to do this. And so, here's my thinking. If a man and a woman has been able to develop a relationship and to build a society on generations and generations and generations for thousands and thousands of years, surely two business people with a shared interest in arriving at an innovation and a breakthrough for their own benefits can make it happen. So I wish you the best of luck in your journey, and I hope that some great things are going to start with the steps that you take today at this boot camp. Thank you very much.
I just let you enjoy now the applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was amazing. Now some technical information. Startups, you hopefully received an invitation link for tomorrow's automotive conference from the Age IPA. If you haven't, then speak to us, come here, because now what is happening is a 10-15 minute coffee break. And we get prepared for the corporate introductions. So enjoy your coffee.